Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 8th chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, these being essentially the concluding remarks. The text follows. Those things which as elements meet together in the atmosphere of war and make it a resistant medium for every activity, we have designated under the terms danger, bodily effort, exertion, information, and friction. In their impedient effects, they may therefore be comprehended again in the collective notion of a general friction. Now, is there, then, no kind of oil which is capable of diminishing this friction? Only one, and that one is not always available at the will of the commander of his army. It is the habituation of an army to war. Habit gives strength to the body in great exertion, to the mind in great danger, to the judgment against first impressions. By it a valuable circumspection is generally gained throughout every rank, from the hussar and the rifleman up to the general of division, which facilitates the work of the chief commander. As the human eye in a dark room dilates its pupil, draws in the little light that there is, partially distinguishes objects by degrees, and at last knows them quite well, so it is in war with the experienced soldier, whilst the novice is only met by pitch dark night. Habituation to war no general can give his army at once, and the camps of maneuver, peace exercises, furnish but a weak substitute for it, weak in comparison with real experience in war, but not weak in relation to other armies in which the training is limited to mere mechanical exercises of routine. So to regulate the exercises in peacetime as to include some of these causes of friction, that the judgment, circumspection, even resolution of the separate leaders may be brought into exercise, is of much greater consequence than those believe who do not know the thing by experience. It is of immense importance that the soldier, high or low, whatever rank he has, should not have to encounter in war those things which, when seen for the first time, set him in astonishment and perplexity. If he has only met with them one single time before, even by that he is half acquainted with them. This relates even to bodily fatigues. They should be practiced less to accustom the body to them than the mind. In war, the younger soldier is very apt to regard unusual fatigues as the consequence of faults, mistakes, and embarrassment into the conduct of the whole, and to become distressed and despondent as a consequence. This would not happen if he had been prepared for this beforehand by exercises in peace. Another less comprehensive, but still very important means of gaining habituation to war in time of peace is to invite into the service officers of foreign armies who have had experience in war. Peace seldom reigns over all Europe, and never in all quarters of the world. A state which has been long at peace should therefore always seek to procure some officers who have done good service at the different scenes of warfare, or to send there some of its own, that they may get a lesson in war. However small the number of officers of this description may appear in proportion to the mass, still their influence is very sensibly felt. Their experience, the bent of their genius, the stamp of their character, influence their subordinates and comrades, and besides that, if they cannot be placed in positions of superior command, they may always be regarded as men acquainted with the country, who may be questioned on many special occasions. So, these are the conclusive thoughts of the first book, which add some remarkable thoughts on the value of experience and of training. So, von Clausewitz starts from saying essentially that we have identified this book, among the other things, these elements that constitute a resistant medium in war. He defines these elements as meeting together in the atmosphere of war. So it's as if, just imagine, it's very plastic as a metaphor, which stresses the fact that these elements are always present, they are always meeting. They can't be excluded, right? And these are termed, as we have seen in the previous videos, as danger, exertion, that would be bodily effort fundamentally, information, and friction. So these are all deeply intertwined, and they work at once. In war, there is no moment in which every military operation is not devoid of them. So, and all of them generate this resistance, right? It's as if, von Clausewitz used in the last video the metaphor of the swimmer, right? You can't do what you do in water as if you were, let's say, we're doing it outside of it. There is always this resistance that, no matter what, is always there, and you can just learn fundamentally how to cope with it more effectively, but never to eliminate it. Von Clausewitz says that these elements have in their impedient effects they comprehend, let's say, in their impedient effects in the general notion of general friction, right? The collective notion of general friction. I mean, the idea that how we call it, attrition and friction, something that fundamentally wears you down. So it's not only a resistant mean, but it's in this sense something that affects you directly and inescapably. And so you are in war, whether you like it or not, constantly degrading, right? Like in the physical world, we are all degrading, unfortunately enough. But at the same time, that's what explains fundamentally what we do and how we do it, and why we transform evolutionarily in the way we do. The same goes for armies in war, you can say. Never stress too much the biological, say the evolutionary analogies when you talk about political and social things. It's not really the same thing. But they render the idea that is fundamentally that the military instrument, let's always remember that war is just a continuation of war by other means, is properly an instrument of politics, and even more properly a political act, is refined as a tool, in fact, as an instrument to cope with the situation in war. And therefore it develops some kind of specificities in this sense that are apt to resist, say to resist longer compared to what a disorganized approach to war would eventually produce, would make you do essentially. So. Then von Clausewitz writes, now is there then no kind of oil which is capable of diminishing this friction? Is there nothing you can do about it? Well, not really in trying to eliminate it, but really in fact to adapt to it. And there is in fact this only one, as he writes, and that one is not always available at the will of the commander or his army. It is the habituation of an army to war, right? So this is a very pragmatic, even empirical if you want, but evident, macroscopically evident truth in war, that the more the army is habituated to war, and the more attrition, friction will have its effects on it, right? Or better, the less the army will wear itself down, right? Not because that friction is eliminated, just because the army has made kind of sensible choices, or is in part aware by itself, not even thanks to the commander, not necessarily thanks to the commander, of what attrition is, and therefore if you by knowing it can cope with it more effectively. And this remark that this habituation to an army to war is not always available to the will of the commander or his army is particularly important, because that's not really something you can wish for to make it become true fundamentally. You have to exercise your army, either through experience, I mean real war experience, or training. And now let's see how this is important. This is so very important because you understand in here that there is nothing theoretical about it. It's not really a dictate that tells you, look, if you do this, this, and that, you will suffer less friction, right? Von Clausewitz is going beyond. It tells the best you can do to cope with friction, and as always, not just in war, but in real life, is to expose yourself to that friction, because until you don't do it, you basically can't you can't know what that is about, and you can't even find the proper tools to cope with that. There is a part of theory, this process, as we will see, and experience is always more effective than training in relative terms, but it still can be conducted in order to to make the army more functional and to be more prepared, essentially, more aware of what are the difficulties that they're gonna meet. This is important also because it makes us reflect on the general idea of war and the problems that derive from it. If you basically put away the concept of war, even as a political option, thinking that fundamentally you have never used it in the first place, you're actively harming yourself, because chances are that you will have to deal with that sooner or later. This is what history shows us pretty frequently, and pretty constantly, by the way. So if you grow unexperienced and you just pretend to deal with everything in a kind of a relativistic way, you basically miss the point of what entirely of what the military instrument is all about in the first place. The direction comes from policy. The poor military instrument in itself has nothing wrong to it. You can do very bad things through the military, through a military operation, but that depends on how you conducted it, not really on how the military instrument works, and naturally the violence involved, because otherwise we couldn't cope with anything. We couldn't cope with our enemies, we couldn't cope with terrorists, we'd simply let ourselves being butchered down by the first target that arrives. So that's the reason why we all have a defense, we all have a military as political and social bodies. So and more importantly, this instrument is not an option, also in the sense that our recurring to violence is really not an option, meaning that we are programmed, basically, biologically speaking, to cope with violence on some occasions. Here we don't praise violence. Fundamentally, even the recurring to the military instrument most of the times is not really the best choice. Really, most of the times, it's just the let's say the quicker one, the if you want the most speedy, right? But it's not necessarily the most effective, and if possible, you should try to avoid doing that. However, you can understand how this can go by degree, especially with states like the ones that major political and military players today. We have to employ in some measure constantly. How many black ops are being run constantly every day all over the world, and about which obviously we don't know much about, but it's always like that. War is forever ongoing, right? Even when we don't see it, even when we pretend to look away, or even when we presume that even it remains confined the way it is, it still has an impact on us and on our ability on our political freedom, essentially. It always has an effect on us as a global system. And this is not rhetorical. It happens constantly, right now. Doesn't matter which country you live in the world right now, your country now is being influenced by what is happening, say, in Syria this time, but also in many other theaters that also are less known and covered by media interest, but that they're still out there. And this obviously is valid for many other political, economical affairs. It's not that the world spins around war. But war is just, in this sense, a tool that is used by these major players that has a reason, has a motive, right? Which doesn't mean to justify it. On the contrary, it should push to look at it better for what it is, and trying to understand behind it why and how it is employed, right? Because it shows you so much about, in fact, as we always say, because of the Clausewitzian trinity of policy and of society. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, habit gives strength to the body in great exertion, to the mind in great danger, to the judgment against first impressions, right? So this is something we can all relate to, right? If you think about a problem you had to face in your life that you never encountered, that you had to deal with by yourself, fundamentally. So there is always a kind of a initial kind of trauma, like, what is this? You find yourself unprepared, essentially because you lack experience in that field. So what von Clausewitz is saying here is that habit to an exposure to certain problems, or dealing with them, etc., gives you strength. Here he talks especially about exertion. It says strength to the body in great exertion, which is also the case. Like, this you can relate not just to problems. Let's not be so negative, but say, think about sport. Who has played sports for many years knows what it means to put yourself fundamentally in relation to the objectives you want to achieve, and how habit is fundamental to keep your strengths up, and to build yourself, more than that, to build your strengths, your body, to cope more efficiently with that exertion, right? So that obviously different sports tend to develop different muscles, there are different techniques. Well, that's what the idea is that you have to be habituated to them. This passes through the mind. It says habit gives strength to the mind in great danger. So here it's not a great physical exertion, but a great a moment in which the major enemy is fear, right? So at that point it's a psychological thing, and your mind gets toughened up by exposure to threat, right? This happens. It's like, if you remember the one of the last chapters we read on danger in war, and that is something that would surprise many of us, but fundamentally von Clausewitz says that when you get in the first line, start seeing people killed all around you, bullets whistling all around, and exposed to mortal danger. At the beginning, you're literally not in control of yourself. If you have never seen it before, that is terrifying. Then he says, after half an hour, you would say, well, but it take me 8 years to get used to that. No, he says, literally, after half an hour, you get used to that, which means that surely you're not in a normal condition, you're still very strained, but still your mind has made itself up to cope with that, to resist with that, because there is no other choice, right? And this is valid for many other, let's say, psychological adaptations. Sadly enough, men can become extremely violent people in very short amount of time, to do things that in certain situations they would never thought they could be capable of, and we know it because it's witnessed basically in every war. So also in here, understanding war helps not to underestimate even the darkest side in you, that is obviously darker sometimes in a social context when there is a moral code, etc. But in other contexts, maybe it's necessary, because it's either you do that or you die. So there are not many options. And this doesn't go without scars. There are traumas that last a lifetime because of this. And don't think that psychological exertion is less important than physical one. It's sometimes it's really dramatic what your mind can be obliged to bear. Von Clausewitz says, habit gives strength to the judgment against first impressions. This is more important. Here we have seen the body, the mind, and here there is this that correspond, let's say, in many ways also to the, let's say, the emotional side, the instinctive side, and the intellectual, the rational side, right? Judgment is that extra that you need to assess, let's say, not only through intelligence, that is something different, but this, in fact, this ability that comes straight from habit. You know, this ability of judging on the base of experience, of something you already seen, and you can somehow sense the coup d'oeil that helps you as a sort of a sixth sense, right? It obviously is not such, but it's a particular form of intelligence and other ingredients that make you more aware about what is going on. And this is a vaccine, let's say, chiefly against first impressions. This is very important because it's also in here we can all relate to this. There is definitely, take your studies or your job. I mean, presumably you're up to something that you have been doing for many years, in which you have to be applied, in which there are challenges that you need this judgment to address, to approach, to cope with, to deal with. So and you can relate in this sense because you perfectly know that first impressions, albeit extremely important, because first impressions are always important. They're not just something you have to go past without reflecting, but are, however, something you don't have to base yourself exclusively on. And knowing that the first impression is often wrong, or at least it's incomplete, or it can lead you into places, let's say if you go beyond it, that show you dimensions that you had never thought of, right? And that's why war, by the way, has this dramatic need for experience, because it's the realm of unpredictability. As we said many times by reading from Clausewitz, war is basically a field in which you have to move constantly, knowing just 25% of what you should base yourself on in order to take an action. That is, you're always risking. By definition, there is not a single operation in war that it's devoid of risk, and obviously in varying degrees, but war is of all the human activities, is the most unpredictable one in its outcomes, right? and not just in the outcomes. Or better, yes, well, in things that as they progress over time, but you get what I mean. I mean, not the ultimate outcome, just victory and defeat, but all that happens in the meanwhile. So this is particularly important because essentially the intelligent person, the responsible person, the person who can do something positive, is the person who knows what's beyond, right? In fact, intelligence means simply this. It means to read within, right? So not simply to look at the thing from the outside and saying, well, that's all I see, but trying to understand what is in it, which in the Latin word is particularly meaningful etymologically because you're still looking at the same thing. There is not a barrier that conceals what's beyond. You're literally looking at the same thing that you look at, but you can't understand until you don't analyze fundamentally. So this is very, very important, educationally speaking. Then von Clausewitz writes, by it, so by habit, a valuable circumspection is generally gained throughout every rank, from the hussar and rifleman up to the general of division, which facilitates the work of the chief commander. What does this mean? It means that every rank corresponds to different experience, to different habits, to different practices, to different exercise, to different actions that are all functional to the specific rank, which basically takes away from the upper ranks in the hierarchy the responsibility to deal with every single detail, which is why the way hierarchy exists, because essentially every individual is responsible for his own actions, right? From in fact even up the rifleman here says the hussar is light cavalryman, but also the rifleman did the average line infantry. So we all have this shared responsibility. That's why, let's say, such responsibility is attributed to each and every one of the military men in this sense, and this enormously facilitates the work of the chief commander, because basically he doesn't have to worry about what is. I mean, he should always at all times understanding how things work, but let's say presumably even at the lower ranks, those who are in charge are doing what they should be doing in that position. Then the ideal would be that the commander was just to address them, to order them and direct them in a way that is at its own scale of its own level of hierarchy pertains to him. All right, that's the ideal. Then attrition comes, friction comes. And this disrupts a lot, but it's still at that point, it's still transversal. It happens throughout all the ranks, and that's exactly that habit that gives you the greater experience and ability to cope with problems. And here von Clausewitz makes another beautiful metaphor, saying, as the human eye in a dark room dilates its pupil, draws in the little light that there is, partially distinguishes objects by degrees, and at last knows them quite well, so it is in war with the experienced soldier, whilst the novice is only met by pitch dark night, right? So that's a bit in the same metaphor of intelligence, really, meaning that things that you actually see because you always have your eyes open, even in this darkness, really can be understood, can be experienced, let's say, can be understood, let's say, better. Only if you have an eye that is able to discern them, right? That is able to make you distinguish them. So this is an adaptive progress, right? So the experienced soldier knows what is going on, because it's seen it all before. The novice doesn't understand, so he can even look at the battlefield but not really understanding what is going on. And it's not that everybody, the experienced soldier, not even the chief commander, actually understand all that is happening on a battlefield. Actually, nobody does, because there are two complex systems, even for eyewitness to really understand what they are. The important, though, is to get acquainted exactly to this. To get acquainted to these complex systems and how they operate in general, in spite of all the things that you cannot understand by definition, because they can't be covered by your mind, because we all have this limit and nobody can go beyond a certain amount of data to analyze as a human mind. But the human mind has this further ability, this sort of judgment that is incredibly adaptive, and is what made us surviving through evolution, and that also other species have, that is based on the ability of assessment fundamentally, and this that derives largely from experience, and that's also how our emotional exposure to this is like. Even those strong emotions that, as von Clausewitz said, take over while you're under danger, they're still a pretty good way, they're a pretty good indicator of the gravity of what is going on. And that's why even part of our culture stresses so much the fundamentally not the ways that the ideas, the theories that we could have, for example, to win a war, but simply stressing the fact that war is terrible, and that still makes sense in large part, as long as it doesn't become an excuse to say, okay, there shouldn't be any form of we shouldn't use in the first place as a community, as society, any form of violence at all, because that's actually instead risky, and it's basically giving up to every danger that can occur. These are all very powerful indicators, and that they are probably the best resource we have, at least in terms of hierarchies of values, because then intelligence comes in, and that is called to this very terrible task of ordering this hierarchy that we feel in one sense, but we don't think directly. So that's why also we need more intelligence than else in order to win a war. But without the experience also of the dramatically emotional side, we wouldn't be able to assess correctly. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, habituation to war, no general can give his army at once. In the camps of maneuver, peace exercises furnish but a weak substitute for it. Weak in comparison with the real experience in war, but not weak in relation to other armies in which the training is limited to mere mechanical exercises of routine. Now, what does this mean? Well, fundamentally, the first phrase, the general cannot presume that his army can get this experience simply because, I don't know, it's under his command. Every good general knows that he has some human material to cope with, just with also the rest of the material that he has, and that a great part of assessing the demands value, let's say, as fighters, as combatants, is based on, in fact, studying, looking at their experience of what their moral is, and mostly their psychological resources, also the physical ones, and therefore there is discipline, there is training, right? You can't put an army on the field without any form of training. So there are these camps of maneuver, what von Clausewitz calls peace exercises, that furnish just a weak substitute for habituation. What does this mean? It means that, of course, no training can make up for the experience as a whole, right? Remember when Flavius Josephus, for example, writes that the Roman military was trained in a way that basically made Romans, experiencing war before having actually tasted it. Well, that's an hyperbole, but it kind of still gives an idea of what it was, because that was a particularly brutal training as well. So there are great things you can accomplish through training, but it's the unpredictability, the problems, the difficulties, the exertions, and all the things we have defined before because of lack of information, tiredness, fear, etc., cannot fully be gained but through real war, right? And even in this, it's not automatic. Like, there are units that are brought on the field, they are disrupted, and still they haven't learned much of what maybe it really takes to cope with certain situations, because maybe they didn't have time, or maybe they had a poor training, or they had poor means. So it's obvious that even elite units, just make an example, are obviously troops that are to be put in. I mean, every unit actually is functional in the measure in which it's put in the condition of performing what it's been trained for. That's really as precarious as it sounds in real war. Like, you can even have the best elite unit and getting it wiped out on the field very easily. Chances are that as an asset you will not throw it away so easily, let's say, so you would predispose a condition, a deployment that would spare them. But in general, also, experience of war is gotten, especially what concerns combat, in very difficult ways. Naturally, there are also the not strictly, let's say, combat training that has to do instead with marchers, with order, with in fact bodily exertion. That is something that probably is the best you can do during you can achieve through training in proportion to what is the real need out in campaign. But it's still a weak substitute. A weak substitute, though, as von Clausewitz stresses rightfully, in comparison with real experience in war. However, this exercises, this training, is not weak at all in relation to other armies in which the training is limited to mere mechanical exercises of routine, right? What does this mean? That indeed, since experience in combat is so difficult to gain, most troops will actually be as good as their training has prepared them for in certain occasions. So what really makes the difference at that point is being well trained, right? So training is generally separated from experience. It is still part of it, though, substantially, and yet it does make a difference on many occasions, and it prepares mostly to test your limits, your balances, to bring men to the limit of their possibilities at the end of the day, so that they can know where and how things start to break down if they push too far, right? And that is particularly important, to know your own limits, but also trying to expand them a little more. There's never a record that can't be beaten, right? Even though we all have definitely absolute limits, you can't jump make a jump of 90 meters but standing without anything. So, but still there is that infinitesimal distance more that you can do. And training is aimed fundamentally at making you rich, not necessarily that as a record, because that would be more like sports than else, but making you work all together, because this is the training is a collective training, and that's really what makes crucial difference in a history of war. It's not really how good a rifleman can shoot, how accurately, because that goes lost when the guy is under fire. We all know that the accuracy decreases dramatically, and this is often a mistake that people make, thinking that really what the outcome of war depends on the individual soldier. Literally, the individual soldier is the least important individual in war. Literally, what really makes the difference is the level of collective training. All right, leadership is fundamental, because leadership at that is even beyond this. So you train, the there is a train for leadership as well, and that's the most important one in absolute terms. But in this sense, what really makes the difference, especially in maneuvering at a tactical level, on the field, but also the strategical level, given the speed of armies, etc., is collective training. What is important is how you're able to play together. Just to make you understand better from Clausewitz times, what is important here is all shooting at once in a thickly packed formation without wavering, having this constant fire remaining there, and that makes the difference, because a group of well-trained, say 100 soldiers, has definitely a higher effectiveness than 100 separated riflemen, even if they were trained individually in the same way, because it's really how they perform collectively that gives the edge on the battlefield. Not always, because the enemy is going to do the same, so at that point it can go wrong anyhow, and this happens all the time for every army, for every from every unit, for every commander. But at the same time, that gives you still a lot of edge, and it's always obviously better to have possibly an experienced trooper, but also a well-trained trooper since the beginning, right? And so to go on, for Clausewitz phrase, so to regulate the exercises in peacetime as to include some of these causes of friction, that the judgment, circumspection, even resolution of the separate leaders may be brought into exercise, is of much greater consequence than those believe who do not know the thing by experience. And I can relate. I was trained for some time personally at a military level, and I must tell you that especially the psychological impact that discipline has on you is terribly empowering, and it makes you really understand how lazy and dramatically lazy we actually are outside of the military, and it makes you really understand what the potential of society would be if we were all at that same level of let's say of discipline. Right, we could literally double our GDPs, from a day to another, if we all had this determination, this pressure at the end of the day that eventually has a cost, but can also bring dramatic benefit to society if we all were so eager to perform it. So, in training is so important because first of all, it habituates you to friction proper, as we've seen before. It develops your judgment, so this ability of understanding how things tend to go, and probably the most, let's say, the best achievement that you can obtain in terms of judgment is the awareness that things tend to go terribly wrong most of the times. I mean, even at a collective level, problems are kind of multiplicated simply because it's more complex system, right? So even though the individual soldier in this sense is more reliable for what concerns him, you still can get better performance through collective training. Always bearing in mind, though, that this derives mostly from this happens mostly if everything is alright. And what happens whether it's alright or not? Yes, it does partly depend also on the individual soldier, but it also has to do with lots of other stuff that are overwhelming, and then most of the times you can't do anything about it, about them. So this teaches you, in fact, as a consequence, circumspection, as von Clausewitz writes. That is, stay sharp, right? Don't lower your guard. Be always aware that things can go worse than you can ever imagine, and they will. So be prepared for that, because at least being aware of it does make a difference in the first place. And that's what we are not, I believe, out here when we do not get interested in war, and in this sense in political and military history, because we basically renounce to understand things that happen, and they happen in a way that in fact you don't expect, and in fact this ignorance is exploited by people who have political and military goals, right? Wars are fought, will always be fought on battlefields, but there are acts of war that are literally performed via the internet. I'm not kidding. Look at what happened to Lithuania back in the day, or there is so much that makes us weak about the ignorance of history in general, right? So that it's not anecdotal to say, oh, history is important. History is not important because you can become an old person saying to have read, I don't know, 1,000 books. That's not really the point. The point of knowing history is that it gives you a tremendous edge in political awareness that other people don't have, and this is a valuable asset we should all invest in as societies, and therefore understand making war basically just let's say a corollary or a complement of what political awareness is about. And war showing how the most dramatic aspect of the story can become. And here von Clausewitz says also another interesting thing, that says that training can boost definitely also the resolution of the separate leaders, right? So here leadership is trained through this form of training that can vary at this point from purely intellectual exercise to commanding men on the field. And as you know, resolution is defined by von Clausewitz as this form of courage, essentially, that is kind of consubstantial to courage, to use kind of a theologically sounding terminology. That, however, is not mere courage, it's not blind courage, but is fundamentally the courage that it takes for thoughts to be transferred into action, so that you can have definitely a pretty clear view of what's going on, but you may not have the guts to act accordingly. So that's a very important prerequisite for a good military leader. So definitely military leaders do compete with each other, as you know, great part also of potentially of disasters, but also in part great part of this habituation also to war derives from competition among officers about people who are in charge, right? And there is always this form of let's say in fact of competition that that is meant to simulate partly the competition that exists between the enemies at the end of the day. So war games are so cool because they try to show you that, and it's obviously, I'm not talking about war games, I mean like the ones you play with boards, etc. Those can be useful in part, but there are certain games that are way more complicated than what they seem, because war games tend, at least the ones people used to play, tend to to solve the thing because there are rules, right? So you may not, there is a degree of chance, but that is purely disconnected with reality. It's just it can happen like that in war, but in war it will happen for what happens in reality, not just because you throw a dice. So the best tactical exercises are definitely the one you can make on a map, inventing units, positions, and objectives, and trying to sort that out and to solve it. And it's dramatically difficult. I think like 95% of people do not do that, and they don't even know what it is. They wouldn't even know how to play that in the first place, and that is seriously dramatic, because it shows that we absolutely, as societies, we don't develop any. And that is like, it's not just for war. It's also a form of intelligence that you developed alongside with death, right? That you can apply in many other fields of your life. So, am I saying that people in general are stupid? Well, yes. I mean, given their potential, we are definitely pretty stupid, I believe, and that's maybe a reason why the average military man is, at least I've read the statistics in the United States, is more intelligent than the average civilian. Also, to counter a bit the stereotype that a soldier is just a brute that doesn't understand. No, in order to be in the military, you have to have a minimal intelligence. Let's say it is, and the average intelligence in the military is superior to one civilian. I don't know about other countries, but I assume is like this pretty much everywhere. That is still theoretically, however, a very low intelligence, considering the potential that every human being has, right? So never magnify. Never idealize, I mean. So yes, even resolution is important, because it makes the Krieges spielen, right? It makes you really play, trying to simulate. Yeah, this is the word I was searching for. It's simulation. It partly does simulate what war is, very weakly, but still kind of effectively for average standards, right? For beginners. Then what von Clausewitz says is, and he stresses also this fact, in fact, that until you don't come to test this stuff, you can't not know how effective it is. I can relate to that. I mean, until you don't play these games, you don't understand how difficult they are. Until you're not trained by a commander, you don't know what it means to stay in line, to perform certain duties, to have to do it in a certain amount of time, etc. It toughens you, it strengthens you, and the big difference is that up to that point you didn't know how it was like. You had seen it in movies, you had heard it, but you had never experienced it. So experience is this incredible oil fluidifier, as von Clausewitz puts it, for military effectiveness, and to partly counter, let's say, or reduce, say better, the resistance that friction operates continuously on you in war. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, it is of immense importance that the soldier, high or low, whatever rank he has, should not have to encounter in war those things which, when seen for the first time, set him in astonishment and perplexity. Right? So the moral of the story is, of course, training cannot simulate the war experience, but it's still in this sense a tragedy when the soldier is acquainted the hardest way with them, without having, at the point of blocking him or astonishing or perplexing him, right? And therefore having a very powerful effect. Always remember, as von Clausewitz teaches, the especially moral resources are dramatically mobile, right? You can toughen your body up through exercise, and that will remain for some time, independently from your own will. But if you're scared, immediately you can't, and you lose it, and you run away. You can, in this sense, make a much greater damage in proportion than what it would have been for you at that point to be weaker, physically speaking, or just, let's say, able to fire. Like, you can train a sniper for all his life to shoot well, then the first bullet that passes over his head, he runs away. You have lost all that. So you have to invest on moral resources as well, because those are very, very, very important. And that's what, interestingly enough, I would say, in war, aside from, let's say, certain motivations that are sometimes very cheap, like fanaticism, courage in its more instinctual form, elite units are tendentially are both elite from a psychological and a material point of view at the same time, right? It's while generally speaking, conscripts are cheaper troops in both, in fact, in training and in equipment, right? So that is very important, because it makes you understand that here the physical and psychological effectiveness go in pair, right? And that's why it's so important. Fundamentally, you entrust to and probably in this sense psychological resources are more important, because they're subordinated. Because the material ones are subordinated to them, right? The example of the sniper, right? So always bear it in mind. Okay, von Clausewitz goes on and says, this relates even to bodily fatigues. So, in fact, now we had kind of discarded them, but also with bodily fatigues is the same. And here eventually he makes an example that we have already read at the beginning that explains this, but it's important because the bodily fatigues do have an effect on moral, right? We're not machines that can exert themselves up to breaking themselves up, right? We stop first because our brain says, what the hell are you doing? Stop, right? When things are getting dangerous, physically harming, and so on. So von Clausewitz then writes, they should this should be practiced less to accustom the body to them than the mind, right? And that's what exactly we were saying now, that it's not much important for the body but for the mind. In fact, there is also another side of the story, if you think about it, that let's say the perfect soldier is not really I don't know, an Arnold Schwarzenegger looking guy. The average soldier is normally pretty slim. It's not excessively he's well built, it's well definite more, but it's not enormous. It doesn't have to be a particularly strong person. It has to be someone who has to be effective. He needs that body to minimize even expenses, costs, energies, etc. He has to be more like a good mind. Always bearing in mind, of course, that in order to carry out certain tasks, you also have to be pretty well physically exercised. So that's what the point is. And von Clausewitz writes, in war, the young soldier is very apt to regard unusual fatigues as the consequence of faults, mistakes, and embarrassment in the conduct of the war, and to become distressed and despondent as a consequence. Here, that's the example I was searching for. And this is very important for von Clausewitz to write it, because this is, you know, a part of those instincts that humans have. You know, and you can relate to this as well. When, for example, your boss, or I don't know what, makes you do something that you had not planned, that is tiring, that maybe you're already stressed and you don't want to do, the first immediate feeling you get, at least to me it happens all the time, is to say, oh, that bastard doesn't understand anything, he's making a mistake, I don't care, and you start finding excuses for it. Then you do it, and you start, when you cool down, you say, well, you know what, maybe this was right, maybe this was the best thing to do, right? So the instinct is exactly this one. So it's obvious that when you're under terrible bodily exertions during in war, I mean, the average soldier tends to believe, or better, everybody tend in general to believe that this terrible fatigue is somewhat an excess that depends on faults, mistakes, and embarrassments of the conduct of war, so that it is, in a certain sense, the commander's fault, right? Which partly is, at an instinctual level, is kind of understandable, because objectively, you, when you're in the military, you are under someone who dictates what you have to do. So this in training maybe can seem, training can be very tough and despondent as well, and distressing as well. But when you are in front of enemy fire and you're basically risking your life, and all you're thinking is, will I ever come out alive here? Well, you probably start questioning, especially when failure occurs, and this happens dramatically often, that it was someone's fault. Maybe it was, right? Well, it may be a commander's fault, but it's people tend to be more prejudicial in this sense towards the negative side of this preconception. And that's something that commander has to know also in realizing what the resistance of his own troops is about. So, and von Clausewitz says, in fact, this would not happen if he had been prepared for this beforehand by exercises in peace, right? So, in other words, if you train the soldier to terrible exertions during training, well, that can straighten more than his body, rather his mind up, and to consider what happens in war, something closer to what he has already experienced, and what in this sense he's supposed to be into, right? And it does work, surprisingly enough. And this, and you would be surprised by how the human mind is flexible in this sense, but also how we are terribly lazy. How nobody basically today would accept to go back in time 100 years to live in the way that they did at the time, because it was too tiring. Come on, would I ever do that? No, I wouldn't. That's the attitude, and that's the attitude in training as well. So if you instead teach, and that's why today people make fuss about literally the most stupid things, because they are not used to understand what real problems are. Because fortunately enough, but in this sense, unfortunately enough, we're not acquainted anymore with really constant, terrifying problems that for great part of human existence have always been the primary concern at every given time of an individual's existence. So never think that progressivity in this sense, that also judgment that we have towards history is not influenced by such softening of our customs in some ways, because we are becoming increasingly less tolerant, or in the sense that we lack the ability to resist. And that can be an achievement in terms of civilization, because maybe we have built a world where fortunately we don't have all of these problems, but at the same time it's weakening us morally. And this is not just a... I mean, really in terms of moral resources, not morally from morals, whichever you may believe in. I mean, really in our ability to be willing to solve problems. I have this suspect that human civilization will not necessarily end because of a nuclear disaster, let's say, but maybe because we will kind of die out at one point. Although I think it's still pretty. I mean, we will let ourselves die because we would lack purpose at one point, which is quite unlikely, because before reaching a kind of lifestyle that will bring us to that, we probably will have to achieve enormous things. So, but we also have genetically this, obviously, this resistance, so that, I don't know, if really a nuclear holocaust came and people had to restart kind of from Iron Age technology, we would still be genetically toughened up in an incredibly traumatic way, but in this sense regaining as a civilization that kind of strength, and starting everything over. So this is not really, hopefully will not happen, but there are also alternative scenarios that can be maybe even worse by certain standards. But you know, we don't really know, fortunately. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, another less comprehensive but still very important means of gaining habituation to war in time of peace is to invite into the service officers of foreign armies who have had experience in war. This has always happened. All armies in history have always benefited from foreign advisors that came from everywhere, that had experience of a bit of everything, in this case of war, but as you know, they could be just trainers, or maybe scientists, people who could improve military capabilities of one's country. This happens all the time. All the time. There's never been an army in history that has done everything by itself. All of our civilization is based on cultural influence. The myth of cultural appropriation as something, you know, it's really nonsense. We all work on what we learn from others on a regular basis. So you want to cry for that was stolen. That no, it doesn't happen like that. And there is no plagiarism on intelligence. Then von Clausewitz writes, peace seldom reigns over all Europe. True, von Clausewitz, we are still in the same way today. And never in all quarters of the world. Beautiful phrase. So the obvious meaning here is that you always find people who have this kind of experience. And not only, because he says, a state which has been long at peace should, therefore, always seek to procure some officers who have done good service at the different scenes of warfare, or to send there some of its own, that they may get a lesson in war, right? Military observers have always been there, and in fact, even foreign elements have always been there in every army at all times. And then he writes, however small the number of officers of this description may appear in proportion to the mass, still their influence is very sensibly felt. So do not think that that this tells you very much. It tells you how intelligence is more important than strength in war, right? It's not about how many people your country can equip to go to war, but really the intellectual resources that you use toward them. So these military advisors really do make a sensible difference, right? Not a dramatic influence. There are also cultural problems in this sense. Certain cultures simply can learn about things, but they can't apply what they have discovered because of obvious limits that exist. But still, the meeting with the other, whether it's pacific or violent, is still this let's say channel through which civilizations evolve. Always remember that war is potentially the greatest destroyers of civilizations, but also in absolute terms, the greatest hybridizer. Let's say, I don't know how to say it in English. Well, yeah, of civilizations. Civilizations grow qualitatively, dramatically, thanks to war, and this is present in every single great conflict that you realize that has a dramatic influence on the ability to grow. Just think about what the Second Punic War was for Rome. Think about and in this sense, think about the costs that are involved in this. I mean, the experience that von Clausewitz is talking about in here is a pretty harsh one. It's not just mere know-how. It's feeling what it is in practice. Always remember it. You can train people, but experience is still superior to that in terms of benefits and outcomes. In von Clausewitz writes then, their experience, so one of these advisors, the bent of their genius, the stamp of their character, influence their subordinates and comrades. So, yes, a great leader has the ability to have a great influence, even just charismatically speaking, not just through intelligence that remains definitely the first thing. Knowledge handed down has this effect, but it's broadly speaking teaching them some standard. And human minds are very quick to learn. It's very easy to get some points, and this also in here there are cultural points you can make on how it is relatively easier to train peoples who have if you want less cultural resistance than others that maybe have already a very evolved civilization that kind of fell in love with itself and therefore doesn't want to give up even in face of evidence. And von Clausewitz concludes by saying, and besides that, if they cannot be placed in positions of superior command, they may always be regarded as men acquainted with the country, who may be questioned on many special occasions, right? So they can also be mere informers, right? So, as we were saying before, not just strictly military information, but also something more. And this goes alongside with everything, because as we have seen, you can't really have a military experience if you don't have an understanding of lots of things about human nature, about human psyche, about geography, about science, about technology, and about many other things, about languages. Information. It's dramatically important for information. So these are all elements that can fluidify the friction, right? So, and this is how von Clausewitz concludes the first book. And next time we will pass to the second one, on the theory of war. Chapter 1, branches of the art of war, and we will see how it is. So, for now, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.